We are recording this afternoon's presentation where this is very relevant content. COVID has proven to be an unprecedented event on the world, and it has certainly been very interesting to see how the landlord-tenant relationship has changed and how it's brought great opportunity to the dental tenant who can never work from home. And for the hundreds we've spoken to since COVID has been upon us, many of which realize they don't want to work from home anytime soon, or retire too early. So I am your moderator for this evening. A couple of quick overviews. We're going to do a poll shortly, just to get a little bit of specific information, and we'll cater some of the content based on the scenarios of the individuals that have attended our course this afternoon. There's also a Q&A section, so I would strongly encourage you throughout. I'll be answering questions as we go. Matthew will be covering a number of topics and handling some of the questions live as we go forward. There's also a chat functionality directly to the panelists, but definitely Q&A that can be done anonymously. If you want to ask some specific questions about your situation, happy to discuss and help. So again, thank you so much for joining our course this afternoon. Again, COVID has been an unprecedented event. I think if there's any small silver lining, we're certainly seeing that dental practices now throughout the country are back up to pre-COVID levels or very close to pre-COVID levels of production. There's been a bit of a super cycle as people are getting caught up on missed appointments, including my own. And definitely now, I think what's most relevant tonight is we're going to be really getting into some good tips and tricks about how specifically can you leverage this event, leverage all the fact that you've seen so many vacancy signs or for lease signs going up in your building and area. And there's been a great shift of power and leverage from being exclusively landlord friendly to now being tenant friendly. So our speaker this evening, which I'm pleased to introduce, is Matthew Donato. He is one of our senior consultants for healthcare leasing. He personally has spoken to hundreds of doctors post-COVID and spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours on the phone, specifically discussing strategies about rent deferrals, abatements, and more importantly, now as we're entering into October, it is a very unique time, especially for those that leases are coming due in the next few years, as there's a lot more leverage through there. So I'm going to pull up a poll, which should pop up for everyone now. So if you can, update your current country where your practice is located. The purpose of the course this evening, that'd be guidance, knowledge, or needing some help with the upcoming negotiation, or if you own your specific practice, specifically to that, as well as where we're at in terms of being reopened. I'm assuming everyone now is fully reopened, and then any additional details about the specific situation and your current expiry. So everyone should have that front here. If you have an opportunity just to take a couple of quick seconds on your smartphone. If you're driving and listening along, don't poll and drive. But we would appreciate it just to get a little bit of a sense in terms of the room, and we'll cater some of the content to it. Again, for those coming through in the US, the PPP has been a great resource to help cover some of the rental rates and the expenses. So hopefully no one is in a default situation or behind. And definitely for those of you here looking through the polls with the lease being expired or expiring, definitely we'll touch on some of the risks involved with that and some of the ways of creating a solution and how to be proactive with the landlord to create a proposal and properly having the quantifiable real estate data, rental rates, local vacancy rates, all of which we can provide you as a complement of attending the course tonight. And especially those that the lease is coming due in the next few months. I think there's a host of you on there. Definitely we're going to be talking about a lot of strategies about why now, how to approach the landlord, what to do, what not to do, and some strategies that are working. And as mentioned before, we've seen an absolute surge of activity. Some of our busiest months in our company's history has been post-COVID. So this is a great opportunity now to start thinking about ourselves, and you've weathered the storm. So first of all, congratulations. Secondarily is now let's be smart. How do we leverage COVID? How do we help to reduce overhead? And how do we help to make sure that we are getting ahead, especially if there's a second wave? What can we do now to protect ourselves, build up the war chest, reduce expenses, and help to make sure that the lease is improved? And especially if the landlord has not answered any of your previous requests for help or otherwise, we'll touch on those strategies as well. So perfect. All right, I will end that poll here. Thank you very much. And now, again, it is my pleasure to introduce Matthew Donato. Matthew is an incredible resource who has helped personally hundreds of doctors through COVID in negotiating the strategies. So without further ado, Mr. Donato.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon or good evening to those of you that are joining us today for our webinar. As Eric had mentioned, yes, I've been spending countless hours helping advise yourselves and your colleagues on really how to navigate these truly uncertain times that we're going through. Now, the first part that I do want to bring to your attention are these three very key numbers: 85, 54, and 80. The first being that 85% of dentists have a lease agreement in place today that can in fact prevent them from ever selling their practice. The next 54. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. Now, given a lot of what's gone on during the pandemic, I would argue that this number at this point in time, given increase in vacancies and various differences that have gone on, that this number is in fact growing at a much more rapid pace. The next is 80%. 80% of landlords structure a lease agreement to give them a right to at least 50% of the proceeds when a practice is sold, meaning that through the lease agreement, the landlord has structured a right for themselves to allow them actual proceeds of your practice sale. Now, another trend given the pandemic is that while landlords are hungry and looking for additional ways to make income, this has truly been a trend that is on the rise. Now, to give you a bit of a background about Cirrus, really who we are, what we do, and why we can put on this webinar for you tonight. Well, first of all, we are a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm, meaning that this is all we do. We focus on the lease agreement day in and day out for healthcare and dental practitioners. Back in 1994, so about 26 years ago now, we were founded by dentists for dentists because we were realizing that more often than not, the landlords and the brokers, etc., were taking advantage of the doctors, really forcing you to sign the lease agreement on the back of the trunk without having any proper representation and actually knowing what's within the lease agreement when you're signing it. Now, at this point in time, we have successfully negotiated over 12,000 dental office lease agreements, and that is continuing to grow day over day. And as Eric mentioned earlier, we have seen one of our busiest times in our 26-year history over the course of this pandemic. And now really what makes us unique is that everything for us is done in-house. We have an in-house legal team which focuses on negotiating the verbiage, things of that nature, as well as our leasing team, which focuses on rental rates and the comparables, really helping to drill down and identify if you're paying a fair rent if you're overpaying, by how much, really giving us those hard concrete numbers when going into the negotiation. And now we also have the consulting department, which I myself am part of. I'm one of our senior consultants, and I really work with yourselves on a daily basis to help give you an understanding of what's happening within the lease agreement, how do we properly structure the lease, and how do we best negotiate, and that strategy to get there. Annually, we represent about 500 doctors throughout North America, and we also deliver over 100 continuing education accredited seminars annually. Prior to COVID, we were traveling all across the United States and Canada to put on in-person seminars and bring our expertise to you. In addition to our CE courses, we also lecture at some of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York, the Pacific Dental Conference, Yankee Dental, as well as the California Dental Association. Now, what's the purpose of today's webinar? Well, first and foremost, it's really to help identify the current landlord and tenant relationship. Now, given what has gone on over the past 6 or so months, we've noticed a real shift in the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Now that landlords are hungry, they need to fill vacancies, things like that, we've noticed that tenants now more than ever have more leverage through the negotiations than ever before. We'll also go through on the importance of the dental office lease agreement. Why is the dental office lease so different when compared to really any other commercial lease, and why it needs to be structured properly to ensure that you are protected? Additionally, we will go through landlord negotiation strategies, really the key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement, what impacts they have, why they need to be restructured, and really how to go about that.
And as a quick note, this is your moderator speaking. We have a Q&A section. I see a couple of questions starting to come through. If you've got a specific question about your specific state, province, or city, or just general questions about your specific situation, I strongly suggest adding that to the Q&A, and we can cover that live or answer the questions individually, privately, between us as well. So, perfect. Matthew, back to you.
Perfect. Now, a question that I always ask is, what is a lease? Now, the most common answer that I usually get is really a 50-plus page list of terms and conditions, which you would be correct on. However, when I think about the lease agreement, and what I urge all of you on today's webinar to think of it as well, is as a check. Really the most expensive check that you will ever write in your professional career. Now, when I'm putting on in-person seminars and I ask, what would be the largest expense that you're going to make in your lifetime? Most often, they answer with a house, or the down payment on a house. And for those that are not dentists, that would be correct. However, when opening a dental practice, as I'm sure you know, there's a sizable amount of investment that goes into the space, and we're there for the long term. Generally speaking, over the life of the lease agreement, you spend upwards of $1.8 million on average to retain the space and stay within the location. Now, if you were signing a check for $1.8 million, I'm sure you would want to know where this money is going, what it's for, and what is attached to that, what hooks are on that $1.8 million. Now, unfortunately, a vast majority of yourselves and your colleagues have not read through the additional 35 to 50 plus pages behind that check and really what that entails. Now, why is the dental office lease so important? What makes it so much different than everybody else? Really, in terms of it, your office location, as I'm sure you know, is the foundation of your practice. Now, during the course of the pandemic, what many businesses have learned is that they don't need their actual location to necessarily operate their business. They can work remotely. They can go somewhere else. However, that just is not the case for yourselves as dentists. We need that location. We need that space. It is the lifeblood of your business. Now, a very common trend that I've heard over the past couple months is that many of you, and I'm sure some of you on this webinar today, have not paid your rent or did not pay your rent over the course of the pandemic or when you were shut down. This could be absolutely catastrophic to your business. What that could mean is, within the default provisions of the lease agreement, that we may be having to vacate, there may be termination rights. There is a whole list of things that the landlord can do if you have not paid your rent. And unfortunately, we have seen over the past couple months the horror stories of this, and those that have been asked to leave or major rent increases, etc. Now, in addition, as I mentioned before, with the fact that your location is so important, really boils down to as well as the fact that this is the lifeblood of your business, but there was also a sizable investment made into this space. There's a large build out cost to actually plumb, equip, and make your dental practice into your vision. And now once you've made that commitment, the money that you have invested into that space is there for good. Now, if you were to decide to relocate or move, how hard is it to move? It's very difficult. It's very time consuming. It takes a long time. Generally, on average, it takes 18 to 24 months for you to relocate the practice from doors closed to doors opened. So more often than not, you are staying within this location for many years. Now, one aspect that many of yourselves and your colleagues probably don't think about is how important the dental office lease is when coming to time of sale. Now, as I mentioned earlier, roughly 85% of you, or 85% of dentists in North America, have a lease agreement in place that restricts or prohibits the sale of the practice. So after you've made all this investment and all this expenditure within the space, it's very important that we have a lease agreement in place that helps us sell the practice and ensures that we do in fact have that right. We need to ensure that these terms are working for you and ensure that this actually enables long-term continuity and security within the space. One way I like to explain it really is we want to make sure that we wrap the lease around your life, have it structured for your lifestyle, rather than wrapping your life around the lease and working for the lease agreement. Now, what should the office lease do for you? First and foremost, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. We want to take a look at internal versus external fees. Now, what do I produce? What is my overhead? What are my expenditures? And take that and look at it from a standpoint of what are the asking rates currently in the market? What are similar spaces going for? How does my lease agreement size up towards that? But importantly, we want to ensure that we're within a lease agreement that we can actually afford. Additionally, when looking at common area maintenance fees, or those of you that are within a triple net lease, many of you are overpaying today. The lease has been structured to allow the landlord to charge you for certain aspects that may not in fact be fair or reasonable. Now, especially given vacancies increasing, we want to ensure that those additional common area maintenance fees that should have been paid off by other tenants has not now been passed on to you. Very important that that is structured properly. Now, and for those of you that have built out your space, started from scratch, if you had received any tenant improvement allowance from the landlord, more often than not, those are baked into the rental rates and are inflating your rents today. Unfortunately, far too many believe that it's free money or fool's gold. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The landlord is never giving away free money. They want to keep that money coming back, and once you've accepted the tenant improvement allowance in your lease rate, it stays and it continues to compound annually. So at the end of the term, you end up paying the landlord back for that tenant improvement allowance and
Just on that note, it's Eric, your moderator here. Some good questions that have been cropping up regarding rental rates, rental rate analysis, data points, etc. So whether you're in Alberta, Canada, or Northern California, it is top of mind. So just to answer a couple of those quick questions on a high level is yes. For all those who have attended, we will do a complimentary lease review, which you can request at the end through some of the polls or in the exit survey. In addition to that, yes, I mean, let alone Alberta, is a market that's heavily shifted from being now much more tenant friendly with vacancies. And Northern California is also another market where we've been very active lately because all the high-tech firms, right, are now working from home and some are permanent. So all of that prime commercial real estate has now dramatically shifted as so many firms out there are now walking away from their leases because everyone's all the high-tech firms are working in their flip-flops from home. So yes, if you send us the specific building address, we can get all the way down to doing title searches, basic demographics, rental rates, vacancies for your market, submarket, etc. And definitely make sure to request that complimentary lease review, rent analysis, and we'll pull up that data for you. Matthew?
Excellent.
And again, for those that have just joined, lots of questions as we go through. We'll keep this as interactive as possible. And yes, thank you for sending through some addresses. Thank you.
So the next point, and building on what I had said at the end of the previous slide, is we want to ensure that there's a long-term runway within the location, and we've created long-term stability and security. Now, generally what I advise is a 10-year term with 2 5-year options. This gives you at least 20 years of continuous runway and stability within the location. Landlords like that long-term stability, now more than ever, given what's going on. If a landlord can state to any of their lenders that they have foreseeable income of 20 years, at this point in time, we've seen that they're willing to jump through hoops and try to secure that as soon as possible. Now, this also gives you leverage because we're looking at this from the standpoint of this is our long-term home. This is the investment that we're going to make over time. In order for us to do that, we need this, this, and this. And that gives us an unprecedented amount of leverage, especially today. In addition to that, the long-term lease and the continuous runway makes it easier to sell the practice as well. Now, today, any of the major financial institutions, when they're looking to grant a loan for an individual looking to acquire a practice, they need at least 10 years of term. So by giving ourselves that long-term lease, even if you're only looking to practice for another 7 to 10 years, and we have the ability to stay with for 20 years, it makes the sale process that much easier. Additionally, the lease should minimize risk and exposure. Now, one of the biggest errors that I see within your colleagues and within the leases that have been sent to me over the past couple months is that many of yourselves are signed personally on the lease agreement. Now, essentially what that means and what you've done by doing that is you've given the landlord free rein to all of your personal assets in the event of any dispute, default. If you are to sell the practice, that personal liability usually continues on as well. So we want to ensure that the lease agreement is structured so that we have the ability to protect ourselves in the event that something does go wrong, whether it be physical injuries, mental illnesses, mental incapacitation, or if you're to pass away. We need to make sure that the lease is structured properly so that we don't have ourselves at the liability of the landlord and at their whim. Now, many of you as well, when you were first starting up, even if you did sign your corporation as the tenant on the lease, may have been asked to sign a personal guarantee, which is essentially a very similar thing. You're now giving the landlord, still giving the landlord, the right to your personal assets. So we need to make sure that we either remove that moving forward, if we can limit that. There's a number of ways to go about it, but the long and short is we want to ensure that there is as little risk and as little exposure to ourselves through the dental office lease. Now, we also want to maximize your flexibility through the lease agreement. Now, maybe you're in the building for a number of years and you decide that maybe you want to expand, or you want to look into acquiring the building. There's a number of ways, once again, that we get the lease to work for you and ensure that it fits around your long-term goals and your strategies, right? Ensuring that we have that ability. And of course, very importantly, ensure that it enhances, not just allows, but enhances your ability to eventually sell your practice. We want to make sure that we turn this lease into as much of an asset versus how it probably is today, which is a liability, which may not actually give you the right to sell. We want to ensure that we have a strong foundation to build our practice upon rather than a crumbling shell. Now, here are some things to look out for in your dental office lease agreement. These are just some of the very important clauses that have been of in recent events have been of high interest from landlords and have been, unfortunately, very detrimental to some. The assignment provision, how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, what the landlord's involvement looks like, demolition rights, ensuring that the landlord does not have the ability through the lease agreement to terminate your lease in the event that they want to redevelop, or if they sell the building and the incoming buyer wants to redevelop, restructure, things of that nature. We also want to ensure that there's no relocation, meaning that the landlord does not have the right to come in and move you to a different location. Now, we just spoke about earlier, it takes about 18 to 24 months to relocate a practice. What impact is that going to have to yourselves if the landlord comes in and relocates you anywhere else in your building, your strip plaza, whatever the case may be, this could be extraordinarily detrimental to business. And unfortunately, one of the most recent cases I've heard was the landlord came in, relocated the dentist to the basement of the medical building because the plastic surgeon wanted to expand. Now she has no visibility and is no natural light. What impact would that have to yourselves? Now surrender, if you're going to leave the location, what obligations do you have if you were to leave? The death and disability provision, going back to what I mentioned earlier, even if something is to happen to you, God forbid, whether it be physical injury, mental incapacitation, or if you are to pass away, ensuring that you have a properly structured, strong death and disability clause could limit or deter any of the liability that would fall onto you through the lease agreement or to your estate as well. Now, continuous operation has been a very popular issue recently, and it is that for any of you that were shut down over the course of the pandemic, if the landlord has a continuous operation clause within the lease agreement, they could put you in default if you were shut down for a longer period than what is within the lease. Now, we're going to look at the option to renew clause. This is just a sample of what's found in 90% of the leases that I read on a daily basis. Now, as we can see here, it states that provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. Now, the first thing that we want to look at here is provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as tenant. Essentially what that's stating here is that the option to renew the lease is personal to Dr. Joe Black. So if you're looking to sell the practice and you only have 3 years remaining of initial term, and you still had those 2 remaining 5-year options, all your incoming buyer has access to is the remaining 3 years, not the additional 2 5-year options. Now this could greatly deter any ability to sell the practice because now your incoming buyer cannot get the term that is required for them to receive a loan. Very important that the options to renew are not personal. Now, if we look at the next part of that same sentence, the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default. For any of you on today's call, if you did not pay your rent over the pandemic, over the shutdown, or if you are still behind on rent, your option to renew can be at jeopardy, meaning that you may not have the right to stay within your location at the end of the term. So very important that this is addressed soon. Next, we look at any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. Now what this means is that what can happen at the time of renewal is that the landlord changes the structure of the lease agreement, meaning that they may add new clauses, whether it be a relocation, a demolition, termination rights. Essentially, it's allowing the landlord here to change the lease agreement to their benefit at their whim. And that cannot be the case. We need to stay on the current lease. Now, next one is the lease is at a minimum rent to be determined between landlord and tenant, but in no event shall it be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. Now, very significant here, essentially stating that in no event will your rental rates ever go down. They will always go up. You're essentially on the world's most boring roller coaster, only going up and never coming back down. So there's a number of ways to structure this properly, but it should not state that in no event shall it ever go down. Especially given what we've seen over the pandemic, given that there's an increase in vacancies, landlords are hurting, the market rental rates have seen a drop. So it's important that we have the options to renew to be reflective of that, because otherwise we're going to be sitting at our set rental rate when other people can come into the same building and pay significantly less. So we want to ensure that this is structured properly. Now, additionally, it says that it shall be determined by arbitration based on the rent for renewing tenants in the building. Now, if none of you or your colleagues are able to bring the rent back down, you'll all continue to increase at once. So a number of, and as mentioned, and as you can see at the top there, this is found in 90% of leases. I see this every single day. Next is the assignment clause. So as I mentioned, this really dictates how you can sell the practice, to whom you can sell the practice to, and what the landlord's involvement in that sale looks like. Now, as you can see there, it states if the tenant should wish to assign the lease or sublet the lease premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. So essentially stating here that if you want to sell the practice, you need to first receive the landlord's consent. Now, though this is problematic, it is very common to see, as I'm sure if any of you were the landlords, you would want some say in who can stay within the space, who can leave, etc. Now, the issue here is what follows. It states within 15 days following the receipt by the landlord of such written request, the landlord shall have the option to, 1, approve the tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet the premises, 2, decline tenant's request to assign the lease or sublet, or 3, terminate the lease upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So what the landlord has worked into this lease agreement for themselves is that even for asking to sell the practice and assign the lease, the landlord has the right to terminate the lease agreement, essentially pulling the rug out from underneath you. You've lost the location. So very important that if any of you have this in your lease agreements today, we must remove this or work together to figure out how we can fix this. Now, additionally, should the landlord consent to the assignment or sublet of the premises? So excellent. The landlord has now come back to us and said, great, doctor, you can sell the practice, you can assign the lease. The landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term to the greater of the then fair market rental rate for the lease premises, or 15% greater than the current rent. Essentially what they're doing is that you sell the practice, you've come to an agreement with the buyer, you're in the 11th hour, everything's about to be signed, and the landlord increases the rent by 15%. Many times I've seen this happen, and the buyers get scared and walk away from the deal in the 11th hour. Additionally, should tenant receive from assignee or subtenant any rental income, cash goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment of the lease or sublet of the premises that is over and above the current base rental rates payable to landlord in any fiscal year during the term of this lease, the difference between the annual rental rate and such income, cash, goods, or other consideration shall be paid to the landlord directly within 30 days of tenant's receipt. So what it's stating there, to cut through the legal jargon, is essentially that when you've sold the practice, everything's gone through, you've been paid, the landlord has the right to those proceeds of sale. And this one here, not half, all of them that were above the annual rent. So let's say you were paying $100,000 a year in rent and you sold your practice for $1 million. You now have to hand over $900,000 to the landlord for the sale of your practice. This can simply not be the case. And many landlords will argue that the value of your business is predicated on the location. And that's why they have this clause in here. But I'm here to tell you today we've been very, very successful at getting this removed. Now, the final point of this clause is that notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released of its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So what it's stating here is that even if you did sell the practice, you are now to remain on the lease agreement. And for those of you that have signed personally or have personal guarantees in effect, you're held on the lease personally after the sale of the practice. It's like co-signing a car for your neighbor's child and saying, have fun, good luck, hopefully nothing goes wrong. As mentioned, this is found in about 75% of dental leases. I see this every day. Next, we have the tenant lease cycle. So we're a very process-oriented firm, and we believe and we know that timing is everything. We as a firm always advise to begin the renewal process at least 30 to 24 months prior to the expiration of the lease agreement. Now, the reason that we advise this is simple. It's purely from a leverage standpoint. As we've discussed earlier, it takes a great amount of time to relocate the dental practice. And don't be fooled, the landlord is very, very aware of this as well. That's why you probably see your option to renew deadline somewhere around 3 to 6 months prior to the expiration of the lease. That's because the landlord knows that at that point in time, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for you to move the lease in time for the expiration. Move the practice in time for the expiration of the lease. So at that 24 to 30 month period, we get to hold that card close to our chest and have the ability to threaten to leave the location if we must. But little alarm bells go off in the landlord's mind when they see that you're approaching them that early. They know that there's the ability for you to leave. So that's why we always maintain that there's the most amount of leverage starting the lease renewal process and negotiations as early as possible.
There's been a few questions on that in the question board. It's Eric, your moderator here. So just to answer a couple of them as we go through. Timing. So it's never too late to engage the landlord or ask for help. If you're in a month-to-month scenario, as I know a few of you are, that does put you at a higher risk than others, because while you might think, great, I have some flexibility to be able to terminate my lease and I have less responsibility, if in the event, heaven forbid, you were to fall ill or catch COVID or otherwise, or heaven forbid, pass away, then as it stands, the estate would have a difficulty to sell the practice because there's no term, there's no predictability of revenue. So in that month-to-month situation, timing-wise, it's, the landlord can also wake up tomorrow or default on their mortgage, and then the bank takes over, and then you're up in the air. And the landlord could send you a 30-day notice and you're out, right? Which could be devastating now. So a few questions based on when and how to engage the landlord. The short answer is, we're going to touch on that shortly, but get all the data, get all the facts, determine the priorities, and the earlier the better. The more time you have, the more leverage, the better the results. Most landlords will wait until the option to renew deadline that Matthew mentioned before, which could be 6 to 9 months in advance. So therefore, right, most landlords will wait until after your option to renew deadline lapses. And then, unfortunately, you're completely exposed because all the remaining 5-year options have then become null and void. So to answer the question, we want to have all negotiations completed long before that option to renew deadline, which is typically about 6 to 12 months prior to the expiry of the lease. And that's in there because the landlord wants time to market and put up a for lease sign and get someone in afterwards. But it's also an interesting trick in their playbook that they use against dentists every day, that they won't remind you of that. They'll only engage you after you've missed. And then now you've played right into the palm of their hands, where you have no more term at the end of your lease. And those 5-year options have become null and void. So I'd cover on a couple of those key questions. Okay, Matt.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Now, currently, and as I've alluded to a number of times through today's webinar, is the unprecedented opportunity that we're seeing today. For lease renewals, long-term lease renewals, as I mentioned, those 10-year terms with 2 5-year options, they are really grabbing the landlord's attention. They realize that they have that ability to have foreseeable income and recognize that income when many of them are at their weakest right now, more so than ever. Additionally, what we're seeing now is the ability to reset financials. As I mentioned, we're seeing a downward trend in the market. Rental rates are decreasing. There's a lot of moving pieces going on, but through our recent negotiations, what we've seen is a truly unprecedented ability to reset the financials of the lease agreement. If you've been paying that TI or tenant improvement allowance, whatever the case may be, now is the time to reset and get those rental rates back to the ideal standards. For any of you on today's call that are looking to start up a practice, the financing is at the lowest of our lifetime. I mean, many of the major financial institutions I speak with, they are practically giving away money to try and help those that are looking to start and looking to either, whether it be building out from scratch, if it's looking to acquire a new practice. Right now is a truly incredible time to get involved and receive that financing. Additionally, equipment and supplies. Many of the major dental equipment providers, they are putting on incentive programs. They're doing their best. They know that it is a difficult time, and they are doing their best to help those looking to start and acquire practices or build out practices the ability to do so by putting excellent incentive programs together for their equipment and their supplies. as well, and importantly, is landlords. As I've mentioned a couple times today, they are desperate to fill vacancies. This gives you an unbelievable amount of leverage coming into the plaza, whether the building, etc., saying you're looking to fill that vacancy that is sitting there, the landlord's bleeding, and say you're going to fill that space. Excellent financials, excellent legal terms, truly a perfect time to start. Now, for those that were asking about rental rates and comparables for their areas, now we have access to all of that. So you can see here we track 95 billion square feet, over 4.6 million properties. We have 1.5 million verified listings, 1,600 researchers, and over 1 million photographs taken. So we are truly the experts, and we know exactly what is going on in your market and have an excellent understanding of how to best argue those financials and know how we sit in comparison. Now, to leave everybody with some strategic information about lease negotiations and really how we operate as a firm and how we've been so successful in our 12,000 negotiations, our 26-year history, really boils down to this wheel. So first and foremost, we gather all the documentation. Right? We look at the lease agreements, the reports, the rental rates, everything. We compile all of that data together and make sure that we have that ready and at our hands and reviewed. Next, we discuss your practice and career goals. Now, how long do you want to continue practicing? What do you want the practice to look like? If you're looking to start up or you're doing a renovation, expansion, etc. And do you want to bring on associates? Do you want to bring in specialists? We go through all of these ideas and goals to get a great understanding of where we see ourselves within this location and how to ensure that the lease is structured for that. Next, we review the office lease for risks. Now, take all those documents that we've gathered and review the lease agreement, any amendments, any other documents from cover to cover, really ensuring that we know exactly what is within your lease agreement, what pitfalls may be in there, what red flags, liabilities, etc. But we need to know that inside out and backwards. Next, we prepare with market research. So going back to all the documentation, knowing what rental rates are in the area, looking at how you compare to others so that we ensure we know exactly what's going on around you and how to argue rental rates and get the best possible rental rate for you. Now, fifth, we have what's called an outcome and strategy development call. And this really discuss what do you want to achieve through the negotiations, listing out your high, medium, and low priority items, really identifying this is what I need to have moving forward. This is some of my like to haves and some things that you're willing to possibly give up in order to get some of those higher priority items. Now, as you can see here, we've gone through 5 full steps and we still have not done one thing, which is reach out to the landlord. We've made sure that we have all of our ducks in a row, all of the ammunition, if you will, to ensure that we know everything prior to even reaching out to the landlord. Now, first, once we actually do reach out to the landlord, we negotiate the economics. So getting you the best rental rates, finding that medium between tenant improvement allowance and landlord work, free rent, really getting to the best possible financial deal and ensure that that is concrete. Once we've done that, we then go forth and negotiate the legal terms of the lease. So many of the red flags that we had discovered in step 3 in reviewing the lease, we go forward and we negotiate those terms. Now, once we've gone back and forth, we've got everything that we wanted, we're ready to sign on the dotted line, we do a final review of the lease agreement. Now, the reason that the final review is so important is that far too often landlords try to sneak in some additional clauses or sometimes take out some of the clauses that we've worked so hard to get. And you'd be very surprised at how often they do try that. So we've developed software that ensures that we track any changes, we notice anything, but it's very important that we do that final review. And once we've finished that, we can confirm that everything's in good standing, it is what we want, we execute the lease. Now you have your perfect practice lease and ready to move forward.
As we approach time, what I'll do is I'll pull up an additional poll, specifically now in terms of situations. I know there's been a number of requests for the rental rate analysis, etc. So Matthew, on the next slide, again, an appreciation for everyone's time here as we're now 7 o'clock on the East Coast. We will do a critical dates and risk analysis. So again, complimentary for all those on the call. I've now launched a poll, which you can click to specifically request. Again, if we're presently a tenant with a lease today, when does your lease expire? If the situation is urgent, again, if your lease is expiring within the next 2 years, if your option to renew is coming up shortly. And then number 4 is that you're requesting the complimentary lease analysis or just looking for some guidance on rent. Please click yes to number 4, as many of you have. And then number 5, again, a few of you are contemplating now expanding or buying a new practice. As Matthew mentioned on the last slide, this is a bit of a Rockefeller type of opportunity to make investments in the down economy. There are no shortage of doctors now that were thinking about retiring. Their spouses are now reminding them to retire on a daily basis. And it is a pretty unprecedented time to be acquiring a practice now. But be cautioned, right? You have a lot of leverage with the landlord when you are to negotiate that. So I see most have submitted. Again, as a quick pause, any other additional questions? Again, I want to make this as interactive as possible. Feel free to post specifically based on any additional outstanding questions. And as you can see here, I wanted to make a specific thanks to Matthew Donato, our speaker this evening, to help cover and overview where we're at. And this, as a bottom line, everyone, this is an unprecedented time to be negotiating and renegotiating your lease. This is a leverage shift. This is 2008 all over again, but in many cases better. So if you haven't read your lease rate lately or you haven't had it professionally reviewed, strongly encourage you to take us up on this. No cost, no commitment, of course. Just an appreciation to help the dental community as we go through the process. So perfect. We'll keep the chat lines open here for another minute. And again, if you have not voted, would encourage you just to click based on your specific situation. Number 2 is when your lease expires. I know that there are a bunch within the next 24 months. Many of you maybe feverishly were going through. Again, especially if it's within the next 30 plus months, the negotiation rule book has changed post-COVID. So again, if you're not sure, happy to go through the situation. I see there's some urgency for some as well. A number of you have obviously requested the complimentary analysis or rent review. And it looks like a few are contemplating the Rockefeller approach, which again is to buy and invest in the downward side of the economy. All right, perfect, great. Again, now we have I'll leave the Q&A section open as well as the chat. If there's any other specific situations, I know we've had some requests from Northern California regarding some rental rates. We will be in touch with you either later today or tomorrow on that. And certainly appreciate everyone's time. Any additional questions from any of our attendees tonight? Perfect. Well, on that note, again, thank you everyone for your time and attendance. We will cease the course and we'll certainly be in touch on next steps. All the best. And again, make sure you have all the information before engaging your landlord. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great day.